Petra does not announce itself all at once. It waits. First, there is the narrow throat of the sick, its walls rising so high that the sky becomes a thin blue wound above you. Then the passage tightens, darkens, bends, and suddenly, through the split in the rock, something impossible appears. A palace-like face carved into rose-red stone. But this was not just a beautiful ruin. Petra was once rich, strategic, and powerful enough to control the movement of goods across the desert. So how does a city like that fall quiet? How does a capital of trade become a place of tombs, empty temples, and unanswered questions? To understand Petra, we have to slow down. Not just admire the famous facade, not just repeat the old travel poster phrase about a lost city, but look carefully at what the stone is trying to hide and what it still reveals. Because Petra's mystery is not only that it survived, it is that it survived in fragments. Water channels without their engineers, monuments without their names, sacred places whose meanings have partly slipped beyond reach. Tonight, we enter that story through the stone itself. Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. And as we begin, leave a comment letting us know where in the world you are watching from tonight. It's a reminder of how far these forgotten echoes can reach. The city before us is quiet now. The cliffs hold their color as the light changes from gold to red to violet. Tourists pass beneath the carved fronts, cameras raised, voices lowered almost by instinct. Yet beneath that stillness is the outline of a different Petra. Crowded, engineered, wealthy, watchful. A desert capital built not against the landscape, but through an almost intimate understanding of it. And that is where the real investigation begins. Long before Petra became a name printed on maps, postcards, and lists of wonders, there were people moving through the desert with a skill that outsiders often mistook for emptiness. The Nabataeans did not begin as builders of grand facades. They began, as far as the evidence allows us to see, as people of movement. Their world stretched across the harsh landscapes of Arabia and southern Jordan, where survival was not a simple matter of strength, but of memory. You had to know where the ground dipped, where water might gather after rain, which routes were safe in one season and dangerous in another, which tribes could be negotiated with, and which valleys could hide you from men who thought they owned the road. To someone passing quickly through that landscape, it could look barren. But to those who understood it, the desert was not empty at all. It was a network, a living map of wells, cliffs, seasonal paths, grazing grounds, and guarded knowledge. This is one of the first misunderstandings that follows Petra. People often imagine the city as a miracle placed in the middle of nowhere, as if it appeared suddenly from rock and ambition. But Petra was not born from nowhere. It grew out of a long desert intelligence. The Nabataeans learned how to turn difficulty into leverage. Where others saw danger, they saw control. Caravans crossing the region needed guides, protection, water, and access to safe passages. Aromatics, incense, spices, textiles, metals, and luxury goods did not move by magic from Arabia toward Egypt, Syria, and the Mediterranean. They moved through human systems, agreements, tolls, resting places, alliances, and warnings passed along from one group to another. And in that kind of world, knowledge could become power before a kingdom ever needed marble, armies, or palace walls. The early Nabataeans seem to have understood something that more settled empires sometimes forgot. You do not have to conquer every mile of land to control what happens across it. Sometimes it is enough to control the points of passage. A spring, a gorge, a meeting place between routes, a valley where animals can rest and merchants can breathe again. Petra's location mattered because it sat near the arteries of desert trade. But location alone does not build a kingdom. Many places sit near useful routes and never become capitals. The Nabataean achievement was not simply finding Petra. It was recognizing what that landscape could become when terrain, water, commerce, and political judgment were brought together. Their rise was gradual, and the details are not always clear. That matters. The Nabataeans did not leave behind the kind of neat royal archive that would make historians' lives easier. A small discourtesy, but a significant one. Much of what we know must be reconstructed from inscriptions, archaeology, later references, and the remains of the city itself. The result is a history with firm outlines and missing rooms. Still, a pattern emerges. By mastering the desert, the Nabataeans became difficult to defeat and useful to deal with. Their mobility gave them options. Their knowledge of routes gave them bargaining power. Their control over water and caravan movement made them indispensable to trade. Over time, what may once have been loose groups of desert people developed into a political force with Petra as its heart. This kind of rise does not fit the usual image of ancient power. There is no single dramatic founding moment preserved for us. No clean scene of a king standing over a valley and declaring that a city will be carved here. The story is quieter and in some ways more impressive. It is the story of adaptation becoming organization. That is why Petra should not be understood only as an architectural marvel. Architecture was the visible result. The deeper foundation was social and environmental skill. The Nabataeans had to coordinate labor, manage trade relationships, protect wealth, absorb foreign influences, and still remain rooted enough in their own identity to hold a kingdom together. And they did all this in a place that punished arrogance. The desert does not care about imperial confidence. It strips plans down to practical knowledge. A ruler who does not understand water fails. A merchant who misjudges distance loses animals, cargo, perhaps everything. An army that does not know the terrain can find itself powerful in theory and helpless in practice. The Nabataeans built their early strength in that gap between map and reality. To outsiders, their homeland may have seemed remote. To them, it was central, because they understood what passed through it. Wealth in the ancient world was not only stored in palaces or counted in coin, it moved on animal backs, in sealed jars, in bundles of cloth, in fragrant resins worth more than their weight suggested. Whoever could protect, tax, and guide that movement could become rich without looking like a conventional empire. This is the first secret behind Petra's later splendor. Before the cliffs were carved into monumental faces, before visitors stood stunned before the treasury, before legends tried to explain what people no longer understood, there was a practical achievement: the conversion of desert survival into political authority. It may be tempting to imagine the Nabataeans as mysterious simply because they are less familiar than Rome or Egypt. But their mystery is not a lack of importance. It is partly a problem of visibility. Empires that leave behind long-written histories tend to dominate our imagination. Peoples who leave behind stone, inscriptions, and traces of movement ask us to listen differently. Petra, in that sense, is not silent because nothing happened there. It is silent because the evidence speaks in a lower voice. And when you begin to hear it, the city changes. The carved monuments no longer seem like isolated wonders. They become the outer skin of a much older story. A story of people who learned the desert so well that for a time, they made it the foundation of a kingdom. Petra's greatest monument may not be the treasury. That is a strange thing to say, because the treasury is the image everyone remembers. The carved columns, the shadowed doorway, the theatrical reveal at the end of the Sikh. It has the confidence of a building that knows it will be photographed for centuries. But the deeper achievement of Petra was less visible. It ran along rock faces. It hid inside channels. It collected in cisterns, slowed behind dams, and moved through the city with a discipline that was both practical and almost poetic. Petra was a city built on water that should not have been there. The surrounding landscape is dry, rugged, and unforgiving. Rain does fall, but not in the steady, generous way a city can depend on. In desert and semi-desert terrain, water often arrives as a problem before it becomes a blessing. Too little, and a settlement fails. Too much at once, and the same valleys that seem harmless can turn violent with sudden floods. The Nabataeans had to solve both dangers. They did not simply search for water. They managed its behavior. Along the cliffs and wadis around Petra, they created a system of dams, channels, cisterns, reservoirs, and rock-cut conduits that gathered seasonal rainfall and directed it where it could be used. Some channels guided water through the stone with quiet precision. Some structures helped reduce the force of flash floods. Cisterns stored what the sky gave briefly, stretching a moment of rain into weeks or months of survival. This is where Petra stops being only beautiful and becomes intelligent. A visitor looking at the famous facades sees art, wealth, and ambition. A historian looking at the water system sees administration, planning, maintenance, labor, authority. Someone had to decide where water would go. Someone had to keep channels clear. Someone had to understand gradients, stone, runoff, storage, and risk. And because water was life, these were not minor technical matters. They were political matters. Control the water, and you control the future of the city. That is not an exaggeration, though it should be understood carefully. The Nabataeans were not magicians, and Petra was not an oasis conjured out of nothing. It remained dependent on climate, engineering, and continuous care. But their skill lay in making a difficult environment serve a large and prosperous settlement far better than an outsider would have expected. The city's water system also changes how we should interpret Nabataean power. Their wealth did not rest only on caravans passing through the desert. Trade could enrich Petra because Petra could sustain people, animals, markets, religious activity, elite display, and all the ordinary demands of urban life. A caravan city cannot be only a checkpoint. It has to feed, water, host, tax, impress, and protect. Water made that possible. Imagine a merchant arriving after days of heat and calculation. The value of Petra would not be abstract. It would be felt in the body. Shade, rest, stored water, animals revived, goods secured, information exchanged. A city that could offer these things in a hard landscape was not merely convenient, it was powerful. And the Nabataeans seem to have understood that power as something to be embedded into the terrain itself. There is a temptation, especially in modern storytelling, to treat ancient engineering as a kind of mystery in the wrong sense, as if skill in the past requires some hidden explanation beyond human patience and intelligence. Petra does not need that kind of exaggeration. The real mystery is better. It is the question of how a society developed such intimate knowledge of water in a place where water was rare, dangerous, and essential. Their system was not just technical, it was cultural. It reflected a way of seeing the landscape not as scenery, but as a set of relationships. Rock could guide water. Valleys could be defended from floods. Rain could be caught. Distance could be reduced by planning. Survival could be converted into surplus. And surplus is where history begins to widen. Once a city can store water reliably, it can support specialists, stonecutters, traders, administrators, priests, craftspeople, guards, families, travelers, and elites whose tombs would later dominate the imagination of visitors. A dry valley becomes more than habitable. It becomes a stage on which society can grow complex. Still, there is a fragile truth beneath all of this. Petra's water system required maintenance. Channels silt up, dams break, cisterns need care. Rock-cut systems, however impressive, do not run forever without human attention. The same engineering that reveals Nabataean brilliance also reminds us that cities are living agreements between people and their environment. When the agreement is kept, stone can hold water. When it is neglected, the desert begins taking back its terms. That is why the water story has a quiet tension running through it. It explains Petra's rise, but it also foreshadows part of its vulnerability. A city built by mastering scarcity remains tied to the systems that manage that scarcity. Trade routes may shift. Political authority may weaken. Labor may become harder to organize. And then the channels that once seemed almost permanent begin to tell a different story. Not sudden collapse, not a single dramatic ending, more like a slow loss of attention. For now, though, at Petra's height, the waterworks must have seemed like proof that the Nabataeans had done something extraordinary. They had taken a valley of stone and made it breathe. They had turned rain from a passing event into stored possibility. They had built a capital where geography alone would not have promised one. And perhaps that is the most important point. Petra's beauty is not separate from its practicality. The same people who carved ceremonial facades into cliffs also carved channels to keep the city alive. One impressed the eye. The other sustained the body. Without the water, the monuments would have been gestures. With it, Petra became a kingdom's heart. To see Petra only as a city carved into cliffs is to miss the motion that made it rich. The stone is what remains. The movement is what mattered. At its height, Petra stood near the meeting points of routes that connected Arabia, Egypt, Syria, the Mediterranean world, and lands farther beyond. Goods passed through this region in forms that could seem almost modest at first glance. Bundles, jars, sacks, wrapped packages tied to pack animals. But inside them were things ancient societies valued intensely. Incense, spices, textiles, metals, perfumes, and luxury materials that carried not only economic worth, but religious, political, and social meaning. Frankincense and myrrh were not just pleasant scents. They burned in temples. They marked ceremonies. They belonged to the language of devotion, status, healing, and power. Spices changed food, medicine, and trade profits. Fine textiles could move across borders more quietly than armies, and still announce wealth more effectively than a speech. Petra lived from this movement, but it did not live from movement in a passive way. The Nabataeans were not simply lucky people sitting beside a busy road. They were organizers of passage. They understood that trade is never just the movement of objects. It is the management of trust. A caravan had to know where it could stop. Merchants had to believe their goods would not vanish into the desert. Animals needed water. Travelers needed guides, interpreters, protection, and information. Deals had to be made with people whose languages, gods, and customs did not always match. A profitable route was not only a line across land, it was a chain of human arrangements. This is where Petra's power becomes more subtle than conquest. Many ancient states announced themselves through expansion. Borders pushed outward, cities taken, kings boasting of enemies crushed. The Nabataeans certainly operated in a competitive world, and they were not innocent spectators of politics. But Petra's influence rested heavily on something less dramatic and often more durable: the ability to control access. Control access to water, and caravans must deal with you. Control safe passage, and merchants must account for you. Control the points where routes converge, and wealth begins to pass through your hands, even when you did not produce the goods yourself. This is not the romance of the desert. It is logistics. And logistics, in the ancient world, could become destiny. Try to imagine the city not as ruins, but as a working place. Animals arriving tired and loud. Traders calculating losses and margins. Officials or local authorities assessing dues. Craftsmen repairing gear. News moving faster than the caravans themselves. Prices in Gaza. Trouble near a route. Demand for aromatics in a temple city. Roman interest somewhere to the west. A shortage, a rumor. A marriage alliance, a tax. Petra would have been a place where the desert spoke many languages, and the Nabataeans seemed to have been unusually good at listening. Their culture absorbed influences from Arabia, Greece, Rome, Egypt, and the broader Near East. But that does not mean they were merely imitating others. Trade cities often become fluent in borrowing. They take in styles, gods, technologies, coins, words, and habits, then rearrange them into something local. Petra's later architecture would show this clearly, with foreign-looking forms carved into a landscape governed by Nabataean priorities. Commerce made the city outward-facing, but not empty of identity. That balance matters. It is easy to look at a trading kingdom and imagine it as a middleman, valuable only because goods pass through it. But Petra was more than a toll station with cliffs. A successful caravan city has to create an environment in which exchange feels possible. It must project authority without frightening everyone away. It must be welcoming enough for trade and controlled enough for profit. It must appear stable, even when the wider world is not. The great carved facades later seen by visitors were part of that atmosphere of power. But so were the less glamorous systems: stored water, defensible terrain, social agreements, taxation, and the knowledge of where every road might lead. There is also something revealing about the kind of wealth Petra handled. Much of it was portable, fragrant, precious, and dependent on desire. Incense is not grain. Spices are not bricks. Luxury goods live partly in the imagination. Their value rises because people far away believe they need them. For worship, for medicine, for status, for the proper performance of power. Petra became rich by standing between desire and arrival. That is a precarious position, even when it is profitable. If desire changes, routes change. If ships carry more goods by sea, roads lose traffic. If empires build alternative infrastructure, old intermediaries become less necessary. The same flow that enriches a city can abandon it. Trade is loyal only while the route remains useful. But during Petra's strongest centuries, the Nabataeans were not yet the abandoned guardians of a fading road. They were active players in a world where distance itself could be monetized. Every difficult mile between southern Arabia and Mediterranean markets increased the value of those who could make the journey possible. This is why Petra's desert setting was not a disadvantage to be overcome. It was part of the business model. The city occupied a landscape difficult enough to discourage careless rivals, but connected enough to reward those who understood it. It was hidden, but not isolated. Protected, but not cut off. Remote to the untrained eye, central to those who followed the routes of commerce. That contradiction is one of Petra's defining features. A city can be famous now because of what does not move: its carved stone, its still tombs, its empty ceremonial spaces. Yet it became powerful because nearly everything around it was moving. Animals, merchants, rumors, resins, coins, languages, and ambitions. So when we stand before Petra today, looking at its motionless cliffs, we are seeing the shell of a place that once depended on circulation. The quiet is misleading. The ruins make the city seem fixed, almost eternal. But Petra's life was never fixed. It pulsed with arrivals and departures, and in that pulse the Nabataeans found their kingdom. Not by forcing the desert to become something else, but by understanding what the desert allowed to pass through, and making sure that passage came at a price. The trouble with Petra is that its buildings are too good at stealing attention. The eye goes first to the facades, the columns, pediments, urns, doorways, an impossible smoothness of stone cut into theatrical shapes. They are so striking that they can make the people behind them seem almost secondary, as if the Nabataeans were a civilization of architects and ghosts. But no city is built by ghosts. Behind Petra's carved surfaces was a society negotiating identity in one of the most connected landscapes of the ancient world. The Nabataeans were Arab in origin, shaped by desert life and regional traditions, but their capital eventually became a place where many cultural languages met. You can see hints of this in the art and architecture, forms that suggest Greek and Roman taste, religious patterns rooted in Arabia and the Near East, and traces of Egyptian or broader Mediterranean influence woven into local expression. The important word is woven. It would be too simple to say the Nabataeans copied the cultures around them. Trade kingdoms rarely behave that way. They borrow, yes, sometimes eagerly. But borrowing is not surrender. A society can adopt foreign styles because they are useful, impressive, fashionable, sacred, or politically convenient, while still bending them toward its own purposes. Petra was not a museum of other people's ideas. It was a place where outside influences were translated. This matters because the Nabataeans lived in a world where appearance carried diplomatic weight. A city that dealt with merchants, envoys, and neighboring powers had to speak in recognizable symbols. A column could be more than decoration. A facade could tell a visitor, "We understand the language of prestige. We belong in the conversation of great cities." We are not a loose desert people waiting at the edge of civilization. We are civilization in our own form. That may be one reason Petra can feel so difficult to categorize. It resists the neat boxes modern viewers often prefer. It was Arabian and cosmopolitan, desert-born and urban, local and international, practical and ceremonial. Its people were not frozen in a single identity because their power came partly from movement, exchange, and adaptation. Their language and writing add another layer. Nabataean inscriptions preserve names, dedications, and fragments of social life, but not enough to give us a complete portrait. The script they used is especially important because it belongs to the wider story of Aramaic-derived writing traditions and the development of Arabic script. That does not mean every carved letter solves a mystery. Inscriptions can be frustratingly brief. They name a person, mark a tomb, honor a deity, record a dedication, and then fall silent just when curiosity becomes inconvenient. Still, those short texts remind us that Petra was inhabited by individuals, not abstractions. A man commissioning a tomb, a family preserving a name, a worshipper making an offering, an official perhaps asserting status, a craftsperson cutting letters into stone with care that outlasted the voice that ordered them. The monumental city was also a personal city, and that is easy to forget when the surviving remains are so dominated by elite spaces. Tombs endure better than ordinary houses. Stone facades impress us more than lost wooden furniture, worn sandals, cooking smells, children's arguments, market noise, and the thousand small routines that make a city real. Archaeology can recover some of this, but unevenly. The people with wealth often leave louder evidence than people without it. So when we speak about Nabataean society, caution is necessary. We can trace wealth, religion, trade, writing, architecture, and political power. We can see hierarchy in the scale of tombs and urban development. We can infer administration from water systems and trade control. But the daily lives of many ordinary Nabataeans remain partly hidden behind the grandeur of their capital. That absence should not be filled too quickly with imagination. It should be respected. What we can say with more confidence is that Petra required organization. The city could not have functioned through beauty alone. Someone had to manage resources, maintain waterworks, regulate trade, arrange labor, and preserve order among residents and visitors from different places. A caravan capital is not peaceful by default. Where wealth gathers, tension follows. Where strangers gather, rules become essential. This is where the Nabataeans become more interesting than their romantic image. They were not simply desert mystics carving dreamlike monuments into cliffs. They were political actors. They built systems. They handled money, risk, and diplomacy. They shaped a capital that could impress outsiders while serving the needs of a complex society. Their religion also formed part of that identity, though Petra's sacred world deserves its own closer look. Deities such as Dushara and Al-Uzza were not decorative names attached to temples. They belonged to the way Nabataeans understood protection, fertility, mountains, stars, and survival. Sacred stones, high places, and temples suggest a religious imagination strongly tied to the physical landscape. The cliffs were not merely convenient building material. In some contexts, they were part of the sacred geography of the city. And yet, even here, Petra complicates easy assumptions. A society that revered local gods could still absorb artistic forms from abroad. A people grounded in desert traditions could still build urban spaces that impressed Mediterranean visitors. Identity was not a locked room. It was more like a busy courtyard, with people entering from different directions and still recognizing who owned the house. There is a useful lesson in that. Modern viewers sometimes treat cultural mixture as evidence that a society is somehow less authentic, as if purity were the measure of historical importance. Petra argues the opposite. The Nabataeans became powerful because they knew how to adapt without dissolving. They absorbed the world that passed through their city, but they did not vanish into it. The facades, then, are not masks hiding an unknown people. They are statements left by a society that understood the value of being seen. But they are also incomplete statements. They tell us what the Nabataeans wanted to project: wealth, permanence, refinement, sacred authority, connection to the wider world. They do not tell us everything about how people ate, argued, worshipped in private, chose leaders, inherited property, or understood themselves in ordinary speech. Petra's stone is eloquent, but selective. That selectiveness is part of the city's power over us. It gives us enough to recognize sophistication, but not enough to fully enter the rooms behind it. The Nabataeans stand close and far away at the same time, visible in their engineering, their inscriptions, their tombs, their gods, their trade, and yet still partly shielded by the survival of some evidence and the disappearance of the rest. Perhaps that is why Petra feels less like a ruin to be solved than a conversation interrupted. The facades speak loudly. The people speak more quietly. And if we want to understand the kingdom that built this place, we have to listen past the architecture, toward the society that carved its identity into stone, not because it lacked a voice, but because it knew stone could carry one farther than breath. The treasury appears like an answer before you know the question. After the long passage through the cyc, the rock suddenly opens, and there it is. A facade cut with such confidence that it seems less discovered than revealed. Columns rise from the cliff face. A broken pediment frames the center. Above it, another level climbs toward the urn at the top, catching the light like a signal from a vanished court. For many visitors, this is Petra, but that is also the trap. The building known today as Al-Khazne, the treasury, carries a name shaped by later legend rather than firm evidence. The story attached to it imagined treasure hidden in the stone urn high above the facade. And for generations, the monument was wrapped in rumors of wealth concealed by ancient powers. The name survived because legends often travel faster than scholarship. They are easier to remember and, frankly, better at selling tickets. Yet the structure was almost certainly not a treasury in the ordinary sense. Many scholars interpret it as a tomb or a ceremonial monument, though details remain debated. What matters is not only what the building was, but what it was designed to do. It was designed to stop you. That is the first honest reading of Al-Khazne. It is architecture as interruption. You pass through the narrow, twisting approach of the cyc, your sight controlled by stone, and then the facade emerges at the exact moment when the city wants to announce itself. The setting turns arrival into theater. Even now, with crowds and cameras and guides waiting nearby. The effect still works. Imagine it in antiquity, when a merchant or envoy entered Petra after the strain of desert travel and saw this carved face of wealth and order waiting at the threshold. The message would not have been subtle. You are not entering a backwater. You are entering a capital. Petra's carved monuments have often been described as if they were merely decorative expressions, the ancient equivalent of showing off. There is some truth there. Display was part of the point. But display in a city like Petra had political work to do. It reassured traders, intimidated rivals, honored the dead, advertised elite status, and placed Nabataean power into a visual language that outsiders could understand. A facade could be a negotiation before anyone spoke. That is especially important because Petra's architecture drew from several cultural worlds. The forms we see in Al-Khazna and other monuments include elements familiar from Hellenistic and broader Mediterranean architecture. But they are not simply imported buildings pasted onto Jordanian cliffs. They are translated into rock. The cliff itself becomes the body of the structure. The facade is not freestanding in the usual way. It is an image of architecture carved from the mountain. This gives Petra's monuments an unusual tension. They imitate built architecture while refusing to become ordinary buildings. They are both surface and statement. They look like entrances into palatial spaces, but many lead into comparatively plain chambers. That contrast can feel strange to modern eyes, as if the outside promised more than the inside delivers. But perhaps that is only strange if we misunderstand the purpose. The facade was the public act. The chamber behind it may have served funerary, ritual, or commemorative functions, depending on the monument. But the carved face was what the city showed to the world. It shaped memory from a distance. It made the dead visible. It made elite families visible. It made the kingdom visible. Petra's architecture, in this sense, was not just about sheltering bodies or ceremonies. It was about controlling perception. And control of perception mattered in a kingdom built on movement. Traders came and went. Envoys came and went. Rumors came and went. A city that depended on reputation had to make an impression strong enough to travel beyond its walls, or, in Petra's case, beyond its cliffs. A merchant leaving the city could describe more than good water and safe routes. He could speak of monuments carved into living stone, of a capital that seemed to have bent the mountain to its will. That kind of reputation is a form of infrastructure. The treasury is the most famous example, but Petra is filled with carved facades that complicate the easy distinction between city, cemetery, sanctuary, and stage. Tombs line the rock faces like declarations of family power. Temples and ceremonial spaces suggest public religion and civic identity. The theater, cut partly into the rock, points to forms of gathering and performance that tied Petra into wider traditions of urban life. Here again, caution is useful. Not every structure has a single agreed interpretation. Some names used today are later labels, convenient or legendary rather than original. Modern visitors walk through a city partly renamed by centuries of misunderstanding. That does not make the names worthless, but it does mean we should not let them decide the past for us. A treasury may be a tomb. A palace may not be a palace. A facade that looks familiar may have carried meanings we cannot fully recover. This is not a failure of history. It is the normal condition of studying a city where much of the written explanation has disappeared. What remains is the evidence of intention. Petra's builders wanted scale. They wanted visibility. They wanted the cliffs to participate in the message. The city's architecture did not fight the landscape. It recruited it. Every carved surface depended on the natural drama of the rock. Light changed the facades across the day. Color shifted. Shadows sharpened details and then softened them. The monuments were never entirely static, because the mountain itself kept altering their appearance. That may be why Petra's architecture still feels alive in a way many ruins do not. The buildings are damaged, yes. Weathered, yes. Partly emptied of their original meanings. But they continue to perform. They perform for tourists now. They performed for travelers then. And performance is not fakery. In politics and religion, performance is often how power becomes believable. A king must appear kingly. A capital must appear central. A tomb must persuade the living that the dead remain important. A sacred place must separate ordinary movement from meaningful arrival. Petra understood that. The treasury, then, is not merely a beautiful object at the end of a gorge. It is evidence of a society that knew how to stage authority without writing an explanation on the wall for us. It used stone, root, light, scale, and borrowed architectural language to create an encounter. You do not simply see Al-Khazna, you arrive before it. That difference matters. Seeing is passive. Arrival involves effort, anticipation, and transformation. The Sikh prepares the body before the facade addresses the mind. By the time the monument appears, the city has already shaped your experience. It has narrowed your path, darkened your view, controlled your pace, and then released you into spectacle. Few capitals have ever understood an entrance so well, and perhaps that is why the later legend of hidden treasure clung to the place. People sensed that something valuable was concealed there. They were wrong about the urn, most likely. They imagined gold where the real treasure was more difficult to remove. Reputation, memory, authority, and the ability of carved stone to keep commanding attention long after the kingdom that made it had lost its voice. Petra's religion was not hidden away from the landscape. It climbed. To understand the sacred world of the Nabataeans, it helps to stop imagining worship only as something that happened inside enclosed buildings. Temples mattered, of course. Urban sanctuaries, altars, and ceremonial spaces were part of Petra's religious life. But the city's sacred geography also rose into the surrounding heights, where rock, sky, and distance changed the mood of worship. Above Petra are places where the city feels smaller, where the carved facades lose some of their command, and the mountains begin to feel less like scenery than presence. The high place of sacrifice is the most famous of these elevated ritual areas, reached by paths that pull the body upward step by step. Whatever ceremonies took place there in antiquity, the journey itself must have mattered. The climb separated ordinary city movement from sacred approach. That is a pattern found in many cultures, but at Petra it feels especially natural. A people shaped by desert roots, cliffs, stars, and dangerous distances would not have treated landscape as a neutral background. The world around them was not empty space. It was charged with risk and meaning. The Nabataean pantheon reflected this environment. Dushara, often understood as a chief male deity, stood at the center of Nabataean worship. Al-Uzza, a powerful goddess known in wider Arabian religious traditions, was also venerated. Other divine figures and local forms of worship appear in the evidence, though not always with the clarity we might want. Their religious life included sacred stones or beetles, which could represent divine presence without needing a human-shaped statue. To modernize, that can seem austere. A block of stone where we might expect a face, a body, a dramatic image of a god. But that reaction says more about modern expectation than ancient devotion. A sacred stone does not need to resemble a person to hold power. In a city carved from rock, among people who read the landscape with unusual seriousness, stone itself could become a fitting vessel for the divine. This is one of the places where Petra asks us to be careful. Later viewers, especially those trained to admire Greek and Roman naturalistic sculpture, may assume that a plain, sacred stone is somehow primitive compared with a carved deity. But religious meaning is not measured by anatomical detail. A beetle could be direct, concentrated, and deliberately non-human. It could mark presence rather than personality. That difference matters. Nabataean religion was not simply a local version of someone else's system. It absorbed influences, as Nabataean culture did more broadly, but it remained rooted in its own sacred habits. Temples and classical architectural forms could exist alongside older Arabian religious ideas. A deity could be honored in a monumental urban space and also associated with mountains, high places, protection, fertility, or celestial forces. The evidence does not allow us to reconstruct every prayer, every ritual, or every private fear carried into Petra's sanctuaries. We should not pretend otherwise. What we have are traces, altars, inscriptions, temple remains, sacred stones, carved niches, processional routes, and the arrangement of ritual places within the landscape. These traces show devotion, but they do not hand us a complete theology. Still, they tell us something important about the Nabataeans' world. Their gods were not distant decorations placed above daily life. They were tied to survival, prosperity, family, trade, and danger. In a caravan kingdom, protection was not an abstract blessing. It had practical weight. Roads could fail. Animals could die. Water could disappear. Bandits, politics, illness, and bad judgment could turn wealth into loss with uncomfortable speed. In that setting, divine favor was not simply pious language. It belonged to the logic of living with uncertainty. And Petra was a city of uncertainty managed with discipline. The same society that engineered channels and taxed caravans also made offerings. That is not a contradiction. Ancient religion and practical planning were not opposites. A merchant could calculate profit and still seek protection. An official could maintain waterworks and still honor a god. A family could commission a tomb and still worry about the dead, the ancestors, and the powers that watched over the living. Religion gave meaning to what planning could not fully control. The high places especially remind us that Petra's sacred life was vertical. The city did not only spread through valleys and along routes, it looked upward. Mountains offered height, visibility, and separation. Stars mattered to desert travelers not as romantic ornaments, but as guides. Fertility mattered in a land where growth could not be taken for granted. Protection mattered because the desert did not forgive much. When worshippers climbed above Petra, they may have seen the same world their economy depended on. Ridges, passages, approaches, and distant horizons. The geography of trade and the geography of worship overlapped. The gods watched over the same routes that merchants feared and rulers profited from. That overlap may help explain why religion was woven so deeply into the city's political identity. Sacred monuments were not isolated from public power. Temples could express civic organization. Elite tombs could connect family memory with divine protection. Ceremonial spaces could make authority visible. In Petra, as in many ancient cities, religion helped bind together the living, the dead, the rulers, the land, and the uncertain future. But again, Petra resists becoming too neat. Some structures are difficult to interpret. Some divine names appear in ways that leave room for debate. Foreign artistic forms can make local meanings look more familiar than they really were. A carved facade may seem classical to us while serving a Nabataean religious or funerary purpose that does not fit cleanly into Greek or Roman categories. This is why the sacred world of Petra should not be flattened into either exotic mystery or borrowed civilization. It was neither a dark cult hidden in the cliffs nor a simple imitation of Mediterranean religion. It was a living system shaped by environment, exchange, and local tradition. Its mystery comes from partial survival. And partial survival can be misleading. Stone altars remain, but songs disappear. Sacred paths remain, but the exact words spoken along them are gone. Beetles remain, but the emotional force they carried for worshippers has to be approached indirectly. We can describe the evidence, we can interpret patterns, but we cannot fully stand inside the ancient act of belief. That limitation is not a defeat. It is part of honest history. What we can still feel, even now, is the intelligence of placing worship where Petra placed it. The city's sacred spaces did not deny the harshness of the landscape. They drew meaning from it. They turned cliffs into thresholds, mountains into approaches, and stone into presence. The Nabataeans built a capital of trade, yes, but they also built a city where power was watched from above, where the dead were placed into the rock, and where the gods were approached not only through doors, but through ascent. In Petra, faith did not merely inhabit the city, it rose over it. Petra is often described as silent, but that silence is a modern condition. In its prosperous years, the city would not have sounded like a monument. It would have sounded like work. Animals breathing hard after long routes, metal tools striking stone, traders negotiating in more than one language, water moving through channels after rain. Officials, priests, craftsmen, servants, travelers, families, guards, and laborers, all crossing paths in a city that had to function before it could impress. The ruins invite us to imagine emptiness, because emptiness is what we now see. But ancient Petra was not built for emptiness. It was built for circulation. Its wealth came from trade, but not from trade alone. Caravans brought goods through Nabataean-controlled routes, and with them came taxes, fees, services, and opportunities. Merchants needed water, storage, protection, information, repairs, animals, guides, and safe places to rest. Each need created a point where value could be collected. The city did not have to produce every luxury it handled. It had to position itself where luxury had to pause. That is a sharper way to understand Petra's economy. It was not simply a marketplace in the desert. It was a system for turning movement into revenue. Behind the romantic image of rose-colored cliffs was an urban organism with many working parts. Markets would have connected local residents with foreign merchants. Workshops likely served both everyday needs and higher status demands. Imported goods entered the city, but so did local craftsmanship. Homes, tombs, temples, storage spaces, waterworks, streets, and gathering places formed a capital whose prosperity was layered into the landscape. The monuments show the elite face of that prosperity. Large tomb facades required money, labor, skill, and social ambition. They were not casual decorations. To carve status into a cliff is to make a claim against time. A family that commissioned such a monument was saying, in effect, "We belong here, we mattered here, and our memory deserves a public surface." But elite tombs can distort the past. They survive loudly. Ordinary life survives unevenly. A grand facade tells us that someone had wealth. It does not tell us how a worker's evening felt after a day in the heat, what a child learned from parents who dealt with caravans, how food was prepared in a household, or what jokes were told when officials were not listening. The richest evidence often belongs to those already powerful enough to leave it behind. So Petra's prosperity must be read with two eyes open. One eye sees the unmistakable scale, monumental architecture, water systems, trade connections, imported styles, religious sites, and urban planning. The other eye notices the imbalance in what remains. Wealth leaves traces. Poverty often leaves stains, fragments, and absences. This is not a reason to ignore the ordinary people of Petra. It is a reason to speak of them carefully. The city depended on them. Stonecutters shaped the monuments that later made Petra famous. Engineers and laborers built and maintained the water systems. Traders and handlers moved goods through crowded spaces. Potters, metalworkers, builders, and textile workers would have supported daily life and commerce. Priests served the sacred spaces. Administrators kept order in a place where wealth, strangers, and politics met. That last point matters more than it first appears. A wealthy trade city is never just wealthy, it is complicated. Money draws opportunity, but also dispute. Goods must be weighed, taxed, protected, and sometimes argued over. Foreign merchants may bring profit and suspicion at the same time. Local elites may compete through tombs, donations, marriages, or access to power. Religious institutions may hold authority that is not purely spiritual. Every successful city has its visible splendor and its invisible negotiations. Petra's silence now can make its past seem strangely clean. It was probably anything but. Not dirty in the sense of scandal, and not dramatic in the cheap way ruins are sometimes sold to us, but human. A city of accounts, favors, debts, rivalries, repairs, ceremonies, ambitions, and disappointments. A place where the smell of incense might mix with animal sweat, cooking smoke, wet stone after rain, and the dry mineral scent of the cliffs. A place where luxury goods passed through hands that may never have owned them. That is one of the quiet ironies of caravan wealth. The most precious objects are not always held longest by the people who make transport possible. A resin gathered far away, a textile woven elsewhere, a metal object shaped in another region. All could enrich the city through movement, while still remaining destined for someone else's temple, home, or court. Petra became powerful by touching wealth in transit, and touching wealth changes a society. It brings foreign habits, foreign measures of status, foreign tastes. It gives local elites new ways to present themselves. It widens the imagination of what a city can be. A Nabataean family with access to trade profits could commission a tomb that spoke in a visual language recognizable to outsiders while still belonging to local tradition. A religious space could reflect both inherited belief and the cosmopolitan confidence of a capital that knew the wider world was watching. But wealth also creates dependence. Petra's prosperity was tied to systems larger than itself. Trade routes, regional politics, consumer demand, imperial decisions, maritime alternatives, and road networks all affected the city's fortunes. That does not make Petra fragile in a simple sense. For a long time it was remarkably successful, but its wealth was dynamic. It required traffic. It required relevance. A city built on passing goods must remain on the path. This is why the ruins feel so haunting. The carved tombs suggest permanence, but the economy that paid for them was fluid. The buildings stayed. The movement changed. And when movement changes, even stone begins to feel stranded. At Petra's height, however, that future decline would not have been obvious. The city's wealth would have seemed embedded in the world around it. In the water channels, the caravan routes, the sacred places, the markets, the skilled hands, the elite monuments, and the ability of the Nabataeans to make themselves necessary. Necessary is a powerful word in history. Armies can make themselves feared. Kings can make themselves obeyed. But trade powers survive by making themselves useful. Petra offered what the desert made difficult: water, security, coordination, and a place where distant worlds could meet without immediately falling apart. That usefulness is what lies beneath the silence now. Not only treasure, not only tombs, not only a lost city carved in red stone. Beneath the modern hush is evidence of a practical brilliance that turned geography into profit and profit into culture. Petra's wealth was not hidden in one chamber or sealed inside one legendary urn. It was distributed through systems, through routes, labor, knowledge, trust, display, and control. The real wealth of Petra was the city itself working. And once you understand that, the ruins stop looking merely abandoned. They begin to look interrupted. Rome did not need to arrive at Petra with fire in the sky. That is one of the quiet surprises of the story. When people imagine the meeting between a wealthy desert kingdom and the Roman Empire, they often expect a scene of immediate violence. Legions marching through the Psyche, temples burning, Nabataean resistance crushed beneath imperial sandals. History is sometimes like that, but not always. In Petra's case, the shift appears less like a single dramatic wound and more like a change in gravity. Rome had been growing around the Nabataean world for a long time. To the west, Roman power had taken deep root in the Mediterranean. To the north, Syria became part of the Roman imperial system. Egypt, with its immense wealth and grain, was already under Roman control. The old political landscape of independent kingdoms, negotiated alliances, and regional flexibility was being pressed into a harder imperial shape. Petra could still be rich. It could still be impressive. But the world around it was changing size. For a kingdom built on roots, this mattered. Rome was not only an army, it was roads, ports, taxes, governors, legal structures, military outposts, and a relentless appetite for order on terms favorable to Rome. The empire did not simply conquer land, it reorganized movement. It wanted goods to move in predictable ways, through systems it could tax, secure, and command. That made Petra both valuable and vulnerable. The Nabataeans had long benefited from their ability to manage passage through difficult landscapes. They were useful intermediaries, skilled negotiators, and controllers of trade corridors that larger powers could not easily ignore. But usefulness to an empire is a dangerous kind of importance. It can protect you for a time. It can also make you worth absorbing. In 106 CE, the Nabataean Kingdom was annexed by Rome and reorganized as the province of Arabia Petraea. The details of the annexation are not as clear as a storyteller might wish. There is no simple surviving account that allows us to narrate every decision, every meeting, every anxiety inside Petra's ruling circles. The evidence suggests the transition may have been relatively smooth compared with some Roman conquests, but smooth is not the same as insignificant. A kingdom ended. That should not be softened too much. Even if Petra was not destroyed in the moment of annexation, its political meaning changed. It was no longer the capital of an independent Nabataean kingdom in the same way. It became part of a wider imperial system, one city within a Roman province, important perhaps, but no longer sovereign. And sovereignty matters because it determines who gets to decide what a city is for. Before annexation, Petra's wealth, diplomacy, water systems, monumental building, and caravan control served a Nabataean political order. After annexation, those same assets existed under Roman authority. The city did not vanish. People did not simply walk away. Trade did not stop overnight. But the direction of power shifted. This is where decline should not be confused with destruction. Rome at the gates did not mean Petra instantly became a ruin. In some ways, Roman rule may have continued or even supported aspects of urban life. Roads could be improved. Military security could be extended. Provincial administration could connect Petra to a larger imperial economy. Roman influence had already been part of the cultural air, visible in architectural forms and political relationships. But incorporation into a large empire can change a city's role even when its buildings remain standing. A capital becomes a provincial center. A negotiator becomes an administrative asset. A kingdom's heart becomes one organ in someone else's body. That transformation is easy to miss because it does not always leave the kind of scar archaeology can dramatize. A burned layer is obvious. A change in political autonomy is subtler. It appears in inscriptions, roads, coinage, administrative patterns, and the slow rearrangement of priorities. It is the kind of change that may not frighten a visitor on the first day, but after a generation, people realize the old world has become difficult to describe. For Petra's elites, Roman annexation may have brought both loss and opportunity. Some local families likely adapted. That is what elites often do when empires arrive. They preserve status by learning the new language of power, by cooperating, by serving in administrative roles, by reshaping public identity to fit imperial expectations. Others may have felt the narrowing of independence more sharply. The evidence does not let us hear those private reactions clearly. We should resist inventing speeches for them. What we can say is that Petra's story after 106 CE was not the story of a city immediately erased. It was the story of a city reclassified, and reclassification can be quietly devastating. The Romans were practical rulers. They valued roads, security, taxation, and reliable channels of movement. If a route served imperial needs, it might be maintained. If another route served those needs better, attention could shift. Petra's old power had depended on being necessary. Under Rome, necessity was increasingly defined by imperial planners whose horizons stretched far beyond the Nabataean capital. This did not make Petra irrelevant at once, but it placed the city in a competition it no longer fully controlled. That is the deeper meaning of Rome at the gates. The threat was not only military conquest, it was absorption into a system large enough to make local brilliance seem optional. Petra's water engineering remained remarkable. Its monuments remained impressive. Its people remained present. Yet the political structure that had made Petra the center of a kingdom had been replaced by one in which decisions could be made elsewhere. Empires do this. They do not always destroy the cities they conquer. Sometimes they preserve them, rename them, improve them, tax them, use them, and slowly alter the reasons they matter. Petra survived Rome's arrival, but it did not survive unchanged. The carved facades still faced the sun. The water channels still needed care. Traders still moved through the region. Worship continued. Families buried their dead. Markets opened and closed. Life went on because life almost always goes on longer than the clean endings in history books. Yet beneath that continuity, a boundary had been crossed. The Nabataean Kingdom, which had grown from desert knowledge into commercial and political power, had lost its independence. Petra's future would now depend not only on its own skill, but on the shifting interests of an empire that could connect the world in new ways, and just as easily redirect that world around it. Petra's decline did not begin with a scream. It began with adjustment. A merchant chooses a different route because it is cheaper this season. A shipment moves by sea instead of crossing the difficult interior. Roman roads make another path easier to tax, guard, and predict. A port grows busier. A desert stop receives fewer animals than it once did. The change is small enough at first that no one has to call it a crisis. Then the pattern repeats. This is how some cities begin to fade, not because an enemy has shattered their gates, but because the world quietly stops needing them in the same way. For Petra, this point is essential. The city was not simply lost one day, as if a curtain dropped over the valley and everyone forgot the way in. Its decline was gradual, tied to changes in trade routes, imperial infrastructure, regional economics, and the growing importance of maritime commerce. The very systems that had once enriched Petra became less dependable as the movement of goods shifted elsewhere. That is a hard kind of decline to dramatize, because it has no single villain. Rome did not have to hate Petra for Petra to lose influence. The sea did not have to conquer the desert with banners. A road built somewhere else could matter as much as a battle. A safer port, a more efficient shipping route, a new administrative preference. These could all reduce the traffic that had once made Petra necessary, and necessary had always been the key. The Nabataeans built their power by controlling passage through difficult terrain. Their city prospered because caravans needed what Petra could offer: water, security, coordination, rest, taxation, exchange, and access. But trade networks are not loyal to memory. They respond to cost, risk, politics, and demand. When the calculation changes, merchants follow the new advantage. This does not mean the old routes immediately emptied. History rarely moves with that kind of neatness. Caravans continued, people remained. Petra did not become a ghost city the morning after one shipping decision, but the balance was shifting. A city dependent on flow can survive a reduction for a time, especially if it has accumulated wealth and local importance. What it cannot easily survive is becoming less central generation after generation. The danger is not absence. The danger is reduced relevance. Under Roman rule, the wider region was increasingly shaped by imperial priorities. Roads were built and maintained to serve military, administrative, and commercial needs. Some of this may have benefited Petra, but it also tied the city to a system in which routes could be redirected according to a logic larger than the Nabataean Kingdom had once controlled. Petra had been brilliant at managing the desert. Rome was brilliant at reorganizing networks. Those are different kinds of power. A desert kingdom could profit from difficult passage because difficulty made local knowledge valuable. An empire often tries to reduce difficulty. It builds roads, standardizes administration, stations troops, secures ports, and creates alternatives. That may be good for merchants in general, but it can weaken the places that once thrived precisely because passage was complicated. Petra's old advantage began to thin. Maritime trade also mattered. Goods that once moved through long overland networks could increasingly travel by sea along routes that connected the Red Sea, Egypt, and the Mediterranean world in different ways. Sea travel had its own dangers, of course. Storms, piracy, costs, and seasonal winds were not imaginary problems. But ships could carry large quantities, and when maritime routes became more attractive, caravan cities felt the change. A camel caravan is a marvel of endurance. A ship is a different kind of argument. The shift was not simply technological or geographic. It was economic. If goods could move with fewer intermediaries, lower costs, or better imperial oversight, the old chain of desert services lost some of its force. Petra had once stood between desire and arrival. Now, in some cases, desire found other ways to arrive. That would have affected more than merchants. A city's economy is a web of secondary lives. Fewer caravans mean fewer animals needing care. Fewer traders mean fewer deals in the market. Fewer visitors mean less demand for lodging, food, repairs, storage, guides, guards, and luxury display. Less revenue can mean less maintenance. Less maintenance can affect water systems, streets, public buildings, and civic confidence. Decline becomes a conversation between infrastructure and belief. People continue as long as they can. They adapt. They shift occupations. They repair what matters most. They reuse buildings. They accept smaller ambitions. A city does not have to understand itself as declining while decline is happening. To those living inside it, the process may look like a series of practical decisions. This year, less work is commissioned. This channel can wait. That building is no longer worth repairing. This family leaves. That route no longer brings what it used to. None of these choices alone is the end of Petra. Together, they alter the city's future. There is a lesson here about ruins. We often prefer collapse to decline because collapse is easier to picture. Collapse gives us a moment, an image, a before and after. Decline asks for patience. It asks us to follow ledgers, roads, maintenance, weather, political decisions, and human adaptation. It is less cinematic, but often more truthful. Petra's story belongs to that slower category. Its fading was not proof that the Nabataeans failed to understand their world. On the contrary, Their success had come from understanding their world exceptionally well. The tragedy, if we can use that word carefully, is that the world they mastered did not remain the same. The desert routes that once made Petra powerful became part of a wider system in which power moved differently. That is one of history's colder facts. Competence does not guarantee permanence. A city can be brilliantly adapted to one age and gradually disadvantaged in another. Petra's buildings make this feel almost unfair. The facades look permanent. The cliffs look as if they should outlast every economic adjustment. But stone can deceive us. A city's life is not held only in its walls. It is held in use, attention, traffic, repair, and belief. When those begin to move elsewhere, even the most impressive architecture becomes a memory of previous relevance. So Petra did not vanish when the roads changed. It became quieter. The markets would have thinned before they emptied. The monuments would have remained impressive long after fewer people had reason to commission new ones. The water systems would have continued to matter, even as the labor to maintain them may have become harder to sustain. Sacred places would not instantly lose meaning, but the city around them would have felt the reduced pressure of history passing through. And perhaps that is the most haunting form of decline. Not abandonment, but being bypassed. The caravans that once gave Petra its rhythm began to follow other calculations. The empire that absorbed it organized movement on a different scale. The sea offered alternatives. The roads that once fed the city's wealth no longer carried the same promise. Petra's silence, then, was not born in a single disaster. It began when the world found ways to move without stopping there. There are places in Petra where history seems less carved than broken. Stones lie out of alignment. Columns have fallen. Walls have been repaired, reused, or left to surrender slowly to weather. The city does not show one clean moment of ruin. It shows layers of stress, human, economic, political, and natural, all working at different speeds. Among those forces, earthquakes were real and damaging. The most famous was the major earthquake of 363 CE, which struck the region and caused serious destruction in Petra and other cities. It damaged buildings, disrupted infrastructure, and must have shaken more than stone. For people living in a city already past the height of its commercial power, such an event was not merely frightening. It was expensive. That may be the most important word here. Damage is one thing. Repair is another. A wealthy city with strong institutions can absorb disaster. It can clear debris, rebuild water channels, stabilize walls, restore public spaces, and reassure residents that life will continue. A city with weakened trade, reduced political importance, and declining resources faces the same disaster differently. The earthquake does not need to end the city by itself. It only has to strike when the city has less strength to answer. This is why the old idea that Petra was destroyed by one earthquake is too simple. It is dramatic. It is convenient. It gives us a date, a scene, a sound. The earth opens, the monuments crack, the people flee, and Petra becomes a ruin. But history is rarely so obedient. The evidence points instead to a longer process, in which seismic damage combined with changing trade routes, reduced wealth, political transformation, and the difficulty of maintaining complex systems in a harsh landscape. The earthquake was not the whole story. It was pressure added to a structure already under pressure. Think again of Petra's waterworks. The dams, channels, cisterns, conduits, and reservoirs that had made the city possible were not decorative features. They were lifelines. An earthquake could damage them directly. It could alter drainage, block passages, crack channels, or make maintenance more urgent. Even when damage was repairable, repair required organized labor, technical knowledge, time, and authority. Without those, the city's old brilliance became fragile. This is one of Petra's quieter lessons. Engineering does not end when a system is built. It has to be cared for across generations. The Nabataeans had mastered scarcity through planning, but no design is independent of society. When the social and economic base weakens, even excellent infrastructure becomes vulnerable. A broken channel is never just a broken channel. It is a question. Who has the power to fix it? The 363 CE earthquake likely intensified problems that had been building for a long time. Petra's commercial role had already changed after Roman annexation and the gradual redirection of trade. Maritime routes and imperial road systems had reduced the city's former centrality. Wealth still existed, and people still lived there. But the great age of Petra as a caravan capital had passed. So when the ground moved, it struck a city no longer standing at the full height of its strength. That does not mean Petra was immediately abandoned. This point matters. People are stubborn, especially in places they know intimately. They rebuild partially. They occupy surviving structures. They move into smaller areas. They reuse old stones. They adapt public buildings for new purposes. They continue rituals, trades, and family life long after outsiders would expect them to leave. Cities do not always die in the way maps suggest. A name may remain. A neighborhood may persist. A church may be built inside or near the remains of older urban spaces. A market may shrink rather than disappear. A grand avenue may become a route through ruins rather than the proud spine of a capital. Abandonment can happen unevenly, street by street, generation by generation. Petra's later history reflects this unevenness. The earthquake damaged the city, but it did not erase all life. Byzantine Petra would still have churches, mosaics, and inhabitants. That continuation changes the emotional shape of the story. We are not looking at a city murdered in one night. We are looking at a city that kept changing after its first identity had faded, and yet the damage mattered. Natural disasters can reveal the true condition of a society. A strong city may rebuild in a way that hides the wound. A weakening city may carry the wound forward. Fallen stones remain where they fell. Repairs become selective. Some areas are restored, others neglected. The urban body survives, but unevenly. That is likely closer to Petra's experience than a single apocalyptic collapse. The earthquake also affected memory. Ruins created by seismic damage can later look like evidence of sudden abandonment, especially to visitors arriving centuries afterward. Broken columns and empty chambers encourage dramatic explanations. They make it easy to imagine panic, but archaeology often asks us to be less theatrical and more patient. A fallen building can result from a moment. A deserted city usually requires a longer explanation. Petra's abandonment was not caused by nature alone, nor was it caused by economics alone. It emerged from the interaction of forces. Trade shifted. Political power moved. Maintenance became harder. Earthquakes damaged what required care. People adapted, then diminished, then left some spaces behind. This kind of explanation, may seem less satisfying than a single catastrophe, but it is more human. It allows for decisions. It allows for resilience. It allows for failure without reducing the people of Petra to victims of one terrible day. There is dignity in that complexity. Imagine someone walking through Petra after the earthquake, not as a tourist of ruins, but as a resident of a damaged city. The question would not have been, has history ended? The question would have been practical. Which wall can be repaired? Which channel still carries water? Which family has left? Which sacred place is still used? Which part of the city is worth saving? Decline is lived as maintenance. And when maintenance fails, abandonment begins to feel less like a choice and more like an accumulation. By the time large areas of Petra fell quiet, the city had already passed through several transformations. It had been a Nabataean capital, a Roman provincial city, a place of continued habitation, and later a Byzantine settlement with Christian institutions. Each phase used the old city differently. Each left traces. Each also inherited the damage and decisions of the phase before it. So when we look at Petra's broken stone, we should not ask only, what destroyed this? We should ask, who was still here afterward, and what could they still afford to save? That question opens a more honest view. The earthquake of 363 CE was devastating, but not absolute. It was one blow among many, made more serious by the slow weakening of the systems that had once made Petra thrive. The city did not fall silent because the earth shook once. It fell silent because over time, fewer hands remained able or willing to restore the conversation between stone, water, trade, and life. The desert did not rush in. It waited. And as Petra's roads emptied, as repairs slowed, as buildings lost their purpose, the city that had once mastered hardship began to meet a different kind of hardship, not the challenge of rising from the desert, but the harder task of remaining necessary after the world had moved on. Petra did not stop being a city when its most famous age ended. This is one of the most useful corrections we can make to the usual story. The phrase "lost city" has a strong grip on the imagination, but it encourages a false picture. Petra as a place that shone, collapsed, and then simply waited in silence for outsiders to admire it centuries later. The truth is more interesting and less tidy. After the height of Nabataean trade power, after Roman annexation, after earthquakes and economic change, Petra continued to live in altered form. By the Byzantine period, Christianity had become part of the city's landscape. Churches were built. Mosaics were laid. Older spaces were reused, reinterpreted, or surrounded by new forms of worship and community. The city's identity had changed, but change is not the same as disappearance. This matters because it shifts Petra from legend back into history. A legendary lost city has one dramatic arc: rise, fall, rediscovery. A historical city has phases. It changes rulers, languages, religious expressions, economic functions, and patterns of settlement. It shrinks, adapts, repairs, reuses. It remembers some things and abandons others. Its people do not live inside a narrator's clean timeline. They live inside the leftovers of earlier decisions. Byzantine Petra was a city living among inherited stone. Imagine the psychological strangeness of that. To worship in a Christian church within a place still dominated by Nabataean tombs, temples, and carved monuments was to inhabit a layered world. The old facades remained visible. The cliffs still held the marks of earlier gods, elite families, and ceremonial ambition. Yet new communities were making different claims on the same landscape. A church does not erase a tomb by existing near it, but it changes the conversation. The evidence of churches and mosaics tells us that Petra still had organized community life after its commercial peak. Mosaic floors require skilled labor, materials, patronage, and a reason to make beauty underfoot. Churches require clergy, worshippers, builders, and networks of belief extending beyond the city itself. These are not the signs of a place instantly abandoned after disaster. They are signs of transformation. That transformation should not be romanticized too much. Byzantine Petra was not simply Nabataean Petra with a new religious soundtrack. The city's old economic power had diminished. Its regional importance had changed. Some areas were damaged or less maintained. The population may have been smaller. The experience of living there would have differed greatly from the crowded caravan capital of earlier centuries. But people remained. And remaining is historically important. It means the decline of Petra was not a vanishing act. It was a long negotiation between what the city had been and what later residents could still make of it. The old water systems, old roads, old buildings, and old sacred spaces did not all carry their original meanings. Some were reused because they were useful. Some were avoided because they were damaged. Some may have inspired awe, indifference, superstition, or practical recycling. Ruins are not always treated reverently by those who live among them. Sometimes they are building material. Sometimes they are shelter. Sometimes they are simply there. This is where modern visitors may misunderstand the past. We tend to see ruins as finished objects, preserved for contemplation. People living in late antique Petra did not have that luxury or that burden. They inherited a city and used what could be used. A carved stone from an earlier age might be sacred to one person, inconvenient to another, and perfect for reuse by a builder who had no patience for archaeology, because archaeology had not been invented yet. There is a small human comedy in that, but also a serious point. Cities survive by being useful, not by remaining pure. Christian Petra shows us that the city's later life was not merely an epilogue. It was part of the story of endurance. The same landscape that had once supported Nabataean religion and caravan wealth now held Christian institutions. The sacred geography shifted. The names of gods changed. The rituals changed. The political world changed. Yet the place itself continued to gather meaning. That continuity complicates the emotional image of abandonment. When did Petra truly become empty? The answer depends on what part of the city we mean, what kind of life we are counting, and which century we choose to privilege. Large-scale urban vitality declined earlier than total local memory. Monumental Nabataean power ended earlier than habitation. Western awareness faded earlier than regional knowledge. There is no single switch. This is why the phrase, lost city, can be useful only if handled carefully. Lost to whom? Lost in what sense? Lost as a political capital? Lost as a trade hub? Lost to European maps and scholarly attention? Lost to the wider world of imperial administration? These are different questions. Byzantine Petra forces us to ask them. It also reminds us that religious change is not always a story of simple replacement. Christianity did not enter a blank landscape. It entered a city dense with memory. The churches and mosaics were part of a new order, but they stood within a place shaped by Nabataean engineering, Roman rule, earthquake damage, and centuries of local adaptation. Every new stone was set among old arguments, and perhaps that is the most honest way to see Petra after its golden age, not as dead, but as overlaid. A city can lose its first meaning and still possess life. It can stop being a caravan capital and become a provincial town. It can stop serving one set of gods and begin serving another. It can lose wealth, repair itself unevenly, and still host prayer, craft, family, and memory. The Christian city in the ruins does not lessen the drama of Petra's decline. It deepens it, because it shows that the real story was not a fall from splendor into silence, but a long series of redefinitions. Each generation encountered the remains of the previous one and asked, perhaps without saying it aloud, what can still be used, what must be repaired, what should be honored, and what can be left behind? In that question, Petra becomes more than a monument. It becomes a record of human adjustment. The Nabataeans had once turned desert survival into power. Later inhabitants turned inherited ruins into a different kind of home. And though the city's great commercial pulse had weakened, the stone still held people, worship, and the fragile insistence that life can continue even after history has changed its route. Petra was not lost to everyone. That sentence matters, because the word lost has done a great deal of work in Petra's modern story, and not all of it is honest. It makes the city sound as though it vanished completely from human knowledge, sealed away by time until the modern world arrived to uncover it. It is a powerful image. It is also a misleading one. After Petra's decline, the city faded from much of Western awareness. It no longer occupied the same place in the maps, texts, and political imagination of distant powers. Its commercial role had diminished. Its monumental spaces no longer spoke with the authority they once had. The old Nabataean Kingdom was gone. The Roman and Byzantine phases had passed into other histories, but local knowledge did not simply evaporate. Bedouin communities knew the region. They moved through the landscapes that outsiders later described with wonder. They lived with the cliffs, roots, tombs, caves, and ruins not as museum pieces, but as part of a continuing world. To them, Petra was not necessarily a discovery waiting to happen. It was a place with names, stories, uses, dangers, and memories. This is where the romance of the lost city needs to be handled carefully. A city can be lost to one tradition of knowledge while remaining present in another. It can disappear from European scholarship while remaining known to people who live nearby. It can be absent from fashionable maps and still exist in local geography. The problem is that history has often treated written outsider recognition as the moment a place becomes real. Petra challenges that habit. For the Bedouin world around Petra, the ruins were not frozen in the past. They were part of lived terrain. Caves could offer shelter. Old structures could become landmarks. Stories could grow around carved facades whose original meanings had become uncertain. The ancient city was not understood in the same way its builders had understood it. But that does not mean it was unknown. Memory changes shape. It does not always disappear. Legends often grow in the gap between survival and explanation. When a monument remains but its original name is forgotten, people give it a new one. When a facade looks impossibly grand, stories gather around it. When an urn sits high above a carved building, someone may imagine hidden treasure. When a city's builders are no longer present to explain themselves, later generations interpret the stones through their own fears, hopes, humor, and practical experience. This is not foolishness. It is human. People make sense of inherited ruins with the tools available to them. Sometimes those tools are written records. Sometimes they are oral traditions. Sometimes they are guesses, warnings, family stories, sacred associations, or local jokes polished by repetition. Modern scholarship may correct the details, but it should not mock the impulse. A ruin without explanation invites narrative. Petra invited many. The treasury, as we have seen, was not likely a treasury in the ordinary sense. Yet the name survived because it satisfied something. It turned an unexplained monument into a story of hidden wealth. It made the strange legible. It gave people a reason for grandeur, whose original political, funerary, or ceremonial meaning had slipped away. Legends like that can distort history, but they can also preserve attention. A place that inspires stories remains mentally alive. Even misunderstanding can be a form of memory, if a fragile one. The Bedouin connection to Petra also complicates the way outsiders later framed the site. When 19th-century Europeans wrote of entering a lost city, they were often describing their own surprise, not the total condition of the place. The city was lost to them. That is different from being lost. The distinction may seem small, but it changes the moral balance of the story. It reminds us that discovery is often a matter of perspective. The person who writes the book is not always the first person who knew the road. The visitor who records the monument is not always the one who preserved its memory. The outsider who brings a place into global attention may depend entirely on local guidance, local tolerance, and local knowledge. Petra's later history sits inside that tension. On one hand, its return to Western awareness would eventually help bring archaeological study, preservation, tourism, and global recognition. On the other hand, the language of rediscovery sometimes erased the people who had never forgotten where it was. That is a familiar pattern in the history of ancient sites, and Petra deserves better than a simplified version of it. To say the city remained known locally is not to say local communities preserved a perfect historical account of Nabataean life. They did not have to. No community carries the full archive of a place for 2,000 years without change. Meanings shift. Names change. The sacred may become legendary. The political may become mysterious. The practical may become ordinary. A tomb may become shelter. A ceremonial facade may become a landmark. A capital may become terrain. But that transformation is itself history. The Bedouin world did not merely exist beside Petra's ruins. It became part of the city's long afterlife. Human life continued to move through the stones long after the caravan capital had faded. The old Nabataean achievement was no longer functioning in its original form, but the landscape was still inhabited, crossed, interpreted, and remembered. There is something deeply important in that. Ruins do not belong only to the century that built them. They accumulate lives. Petra belongs to the Nabataeans, yes, in the deepest architectural and historical sense, but it also belongs to the Romans who absorbed it. the Byzantines who worshipped within its transformed spaces, the local communities who knew it after outsiders forgot, and the modern world that now approaches it with cameras, scholarship, and sometimes too much confidence. Each layer has left a claim. The danger is letting the most recent claim speak as if it were the only one. When we imagine Petra after its decline, we should not picture a city sealed under silence like a tomb. We should picture something more complex, a monumental landscape whose original meaning had partially faded, but whose physical presence remained too strong to ignore. People passed through it, lived near it, told stories about it, feared parts of it, perhaps, used parts of it, guided others through it when circumstances allowed. The city's memory did not survive as a continuous official history. It survived unevenly in place, use, and story. That kind of survival is harder to measure than an inscription, but it matters. It reminds us that history is not only stored in libraries or carved in royal names. Sometimes it survives in the knowledge of paths, in the naming of a rock face, in the decision to avoid a certain tomb, in the tale of treasure repeated beside a fire, in the simple fact that someone knows how to get there. Petra's silence, then, was never absolute. It was a silence created partly by distance from the centers of power that once cared to record it, distance from the trade systems that once animated it, distance from the scholars who would later claim it as a marvel. But the cliffs still stood. The routes still existed. The people of the region still knew the place. And in that knowledge, however changed, Petra did not vanish. It waited in another kind of memory. In 1812, a Swiss traveler named Johann Ludwig Burckhardt entered Petra under circumstances that would later become part of the city's modern legend. He was not wandering casually with a sketchbook and a picnic lunch. He was moving through a region where foreign curiosity could be dangerous if handled badly, and he traveled under an assumed identity, presenting himself as a Muslim traveler. According to later accounts of his journey, he persuaded local guides to take him toward the site by claiming he wished to make a sacrifice at the tomb of Aaron, a sacred destination in the area. The scene is easy to dramatize. The disguised traveler, the guarded route, the narrow entrance, the sudden sight of carved monuments that seem to belong to another world. And yes, there is real drama in it. Burckhardt's visit helped reintroduce Petra to European awareness, and from that point onward, the city began its modern transformation into an object of Western fascination, study, travel writing, archaeology, and eventually mass tourism. But we have to be careful with the word rediscovery. And it sounds innocent. It is not. To call Burckhardt's visit the rediscovery of Petra is to speak from a European perspective. The city was not unknown to the people of the region. Local Bedouin communities knew the place, knew the routes, and made his visit possible. Without that local knowledge, the famous European encounter with Petra would not have happened in the form it did. So what was rediscovered in 1812 was not Petra itself. What was rediscovered was Petra by Europe. That distinction changes the story from one of heroic revelation to one of transfer. Knowledge moving from local landscape into Western books, maps, institutions, and imagination. Burckhardt did not create Petra's significance by seeing it. He entered a place whose significance had long existed, even if its ancient history was only partly understood and its global audience had faded. This does not make Burckhardt irrelevant. It makes the story more honest. He was a skilled traveler, a serious observer, and part of a larger world of early 19th century exploration in which European scholars and institutions were increasingly hungry for ancient sites, inscriptions, routes, and objects. His account mattered because Europe had the publishing networks, academic structures, and imperial confidence to turn a traveler's report into a historical event. That is how power shapes memory. A local guide can know a road for years and remain unnamed in the wider record. A European visitor can write about the same road once and become the person attached to its discovery. The difference is not only curiosity, it is whose knowledge gets archived, translated, cited, and repeated. Petra's modern fame grew inside that imbalance. After Burckhardt, other travelers, artists, surveyors, and scholars became increasingly interested in the site. Drawings and descriptions carried the image of Petra into European imagination. The city's carved facades, dramatic entrance, and aura of biblical geography made it irresistible. It seemed to offer everything 19th century audiences wanted from the ancient Near East: mystery, grandeur, ruins, danger, and the flattering sensation that the past had been waiting to be revealed. But the past had not been waiting in quite that way. The stones were there. The local knowledge was there. The landscape was inhabited and understood. What changed was the channel through which Petra became visible to outsiders with the power to publish and classify it. That visibility brought consequences. Some were valuable. Study of Petra expanded. Its Nabataean history became better understood over time. Archaeology, despite its own early biases and mistakes, began to separate legend from evidence. The city could be placed more carefully within the history of trade, religion, architecture, and imperial change. The Nabataeans, once overshadowed by the monuments themselves, slowly emerged as a subject of serious inquiry. But global attention also brought simplification. Petra became a symbol before it was understood. The treasury became the city's face. The phrase "lost city" became a convenient hook. Travelers wanted awe, and Petra supplied it generously. The complexity of Nabataean society, the later Christian city, the Bedouin afterlife of the ruins, and the long gradual decline were often compressed into a single romantic image: a hidden city found again. That image is powerful because it is partly true and partly false. Petra was hidden in a physical sense, approached through difficult terrain and the narrow drama of the sick. It had indeed faded from Western attention. Many of its ancient meanings had been lost or transformed, but it was not hidden from everyone, and it was not waiting outside human knowledge until a European traveler made it real. This is why the phrase, "the rediscovery that was not a discovery," matters. It allows us to keep the cinematic moment without surrendering to the myth. Burckhardt's arrival can still be imagined. The heat, the caution, the negotiation, the first glimpse of carved stone through the rock. It remains a remarkable episode, but the camera must widen. Behind the traveler stands a network of local guidance. Around the monument stands a landscape still known by the people who lived there. Behind the word rediscovery stands a question about who gets credit for knowing. That question is not only modern sensitivity, it is historical accuracy. If we ignore local knowledge, we misunderstand how Petra survived in memory at all. We turn the city into a passive object and the outsider into the sole actor. But Petra's afterlife was not passive. It was carried through use, story, route, and presence long before it entered European scholarly circulation. The irony is that Burckhardt himself was able to enter Petra because the city had not been completely forgotten. A truly lost place offers no guide. The guide is the proof that the myth is incomplete. From 1812 onward, Petra's silence changed again. It became the silence of a site being looked at, measured, described, and imagined by outsiders. Its stones were no longer only local landmarks, shelters, or legends. They became evidence. They became art. They became a destination. Eventually, they became heritage. And with every new layer of attention, the old city gained something and lost something. It gained a wider audience, protection, study, and renewed historical significance. It lost some of the privacy that had shaped its later life. It became easier to admire and easier to simplify. It entered the global imagination as an icon, which is both a kind of survival and a kind of narrowing. Petra had already been many cities by then. Nabataean capital, Roman provincial center, Byzantine Christian town, Bedouin known ruin. After Burckhardt, it became another kind of city as well. A city of photographs, guidebooks, academic debates, conservation plans, and visitors seeking the feeling of discovery. That feeling is understandable. The sick almost forces it on you. The landscape stages revelation so perfectly that every visitor is tempted to believe they are arriving first. But no one arrives first anymore. Perhaps no one ever did, except the people whose names are lost to us. Those who first recognized that this valley of stone could become a capital. Burckhardt's journey matters because it reopened Petra to a wider world. But the wiser version of the story does not place him at the center of Petra's meaning. It places him at a crossing point between local memory and European attention, between legend and archaeology, between the city as lived landscape and the city as world monument. And in that crossing, we can see how history is often made. Not when something begins, but when one culture finally notices what another has known all along. Petra has been photographed so often that it can create a false sense of familiarity. We know the view through the sick. We know the treasury glowing in the morning light. We know the vast carved faces, the theater, the royal tombs, the paths climbing toward high places. The city has become one of those rare ruins that people recognize, even if they know almost nothing about its builders. But recognition is not understanding. Petra still keeps many of its most important questions unresolved, partly because the surviving evidence is uneven, and partly because the city has always encouraged confident misreading. Its monuments look declarative. They seem to say, "Here is who we were." Yet when we try to translate that statement into ordinary historical detail, the stone becomes less generous. We can describe Nabataean power. We can trace trade networks. We can identify major deities. We can study tombs, temples, inscriptions, pottery, water systems, and imported influences. But the full texture of Nabataean political life remains difficult to reconstruct. How exactly did authority operate inside the kingdom? How did rulers negotiate power with elite families, priests, merchants, and local communities? How centralized was the control of water and trade? How much influence did caravan wealth give to private groups outside royal authority? These are not minor questions. They shape how we understand Petra as a society rather than a monument. The problem is that Petra does not give us the kind of written archive that would make these questions easy. We do not possess a complete Nabataean history written by Nabataeans in their own extended voice. No long royal chronicle patiently explains policy, succession, taxation, diplomacy, and scandal for the convenience of future documentary channels. Inconsiderate, but typical of the ancient world. Instead, we work through fragments. Inscriptions preserve names and dedications. Archaeology reveals patterns of building, burial, trade, and daily use. External sources help, but they often reflect outsider interests and assumptions. Roman perspectives, later traditions, and modern interpretations all have to be weighed carefully. Every source has an angle. Every absence tempts imagination, and Petra is very good at tempting imagination. One unresolved area is daily life beyond the elite monuments. We can see where wealth wanted to be remembered. We can see where power carved itself into the cliff. But the ordinary city, the cooking, bargaining, mending, teaching, worshiping, complaining, inheriting, borrowing, and surviving is harder to hear. This matters because monuments can make a society look more unified than it was. A great tomb tells us about status, but not necessarily about the people who cut it. A temple tells us about public religion, but not every private prayer. A water channel tells us about engineering and organization, but not the hand that cleared it after a storm. Petra's greatest remains may overrepresent its most powerful voices. That is not unusual, but it is important. If we let the monuments speak alone, we risk turning the Nabataeans into a civilization of elites. The city then becomes a stage of kings, merchants, priests, and wealthy families, while the workers, guides, potters, animal handlers, servants, and ordinary residents fade into the background. Yet without those people, Petra could not have functioned for a season, let alone centuries. Another unresolved question concerns the meaning of specific structures. Some labels used today are traditional or convenient rather than certain. A facade might be called a treasury, a palace, or a royal tomb. But those names can carry assumptions the evidence does not fully support. Even when scholars agree broadly that many famous monuments were funerary or ceremonial, the precise identity of a patron, the exact ritual function, or the full symbolism of the design may remain debated. This uncertainty is not a weakness in the story. It is part of the story. Ruins do not come with subtitles. The danger is that modern audiences often prefer certainty, especially when a site is visually dramatic. A mysterious facade almost begs for a decisive explanation. But careful history sometimes has to say, we know the range of possibilities, we understand the context, but the final answer is not preserved. That restraint may feel less satisfying, but it is more respectful to the evidence. There is also the question of how much Petra still has not revealed physically. Archaeology has uncovered and clarified a great deal, but the city and its surrounding landscape are far from exhausted. Some remains are buried, some are damaged, some are difficult to interpret because later occupation altered earlier spaces, and some questions may never be answered because the relevant evidence was destroyed long ago by earthquakes, erosion, reuse, or simple time. The unexcavated Petra is not just a romantic idea. It is a reminder that our current image of the city is provisional. Every generation studies a slightly different Petra. New methods, New surveys, new excavations, and new conservation work can change the balance of what seems important. A place once treated mainly as a spectacle of carved tombs can become, under closer study, a city of hydraulic engineering, urban planning, religious complexity, and regional adaptation. The object has not changed. Our questions have. That is why Petra still refuses to become a solved puzzle. The city's mystery does not depend on pretending that nothing is known. Much is known. Enough is known to admire the Nabataeans for reasons far deeper than scenic beauty. But the remaining uncertainty is meaningful because it shows the limits of survival. We are not missing just facts. We are missing voices. We do not hear a Nabataean ruler explaining why a decision was made. We do not hear a mother telling a child which gods to fear and which to trust. We do not hear the argument between a merchant and an official over a tax that seemed unfair. We do not hear the stonecutter's opinion of the wealthy family demanding an impossible facade. That last one would probably be worth preserving. Instead, we infer from what endured, and what endured is magnificent, but partial. Petra's mystery, then, is not a single locked chamber waiting to be opened. It is a pattern of missing connections. We can connect water to survival, trade to wealth, wealth to monuments, monuments to status, status to political identity. But between those lines are human spaces where the evidence thins. The task is not to fill every gap with drama. The task is to notice which gaps matter. Some mysteries are trivial, the kind that attach themselves to famous places because mystery sells. Hidden treasure, secret curses, impossible builders. These make the past smaller, not larger. Petra needs none of them. Its real uncertainties are already rich enough. How a desert people organized power, how ordinary residents experienced a cosmopolitan capital, how sacred meanings shifted across centuries, how much local memory preserved after written attention faded, and how a city can remain visually overwhelming while historically incomplete. In the end, Petra still refuses to tell us everything because no ancient city can. What survives is not the past itself. It is the residue of choices, accidents, repairs, collapses, burials, and rediscoveries. Petra's stone has preserved enough to command the world's attention, but not enough to surrender all of its interior life. And perhaps that is why the city continues to feel alive. Not because it hides a simple secret, but because it keeps asking better questions than the easy answers can satisfy. Petra did not truly disappear. Its kingdom ended. Its trade power faded. Its roots lost the old urgency. Its water systems required hands that were no longer always there to care for them. Earthquakes broke what wealth could no longer fully repair. Temples changed meaning. Tombs became landmarks. A capital became a ruin, then a memory, then a wonder. But disappearance is the wrong word. The Nabataeans left behind more than stone. They left proof of a particular kind of intelligence, the ability to read a hard landscape without trying to deny its hardness. They did not build Petra by pretending the desert was gentle. They built it by understanding danger, scarcity, movement, and timing. They turned cliffs into monuments, rain into stored life, routes into revenue, and cultural exchange into identity. That is why Petra still matters. not because it was untouched by time, but because it was shaped by adaptation at every stage. The city rose by adapting to the desert. It prospered by adapting to trade. It changed under Rome. It endured into the Byzantine world. It remained known through local memory. It entered global awareness through a so-called rediscovery that was really a crossing between different systems of knowledge. Petra's story is not a clean fall from greatness into oblivion. It is a long transformation. And that is more honest and more human. The silence we feel there now is not empty. It is layered. Beneath it are caravan bells, cut stone, stored water, prayers to gods whose names survive only partly, Christian mosaics, Bedouin memory, European astonishment, archaeological caution, and all the ordinary lives that never carved their names large enough for us to read. Some questions remain unanswered. They should. We do not know every structure's meaning, every political arrangement, every ritual, every private grief or ambition. The evidence gives us outlines, not possession. Petra is not ours to simplify, but what we can say is enough. A people once took one of the world's most unforgiving landscapes and made it not merely survivable, but powerful. Their kingdom passed, their capital quieted, yet their achievement still stands in the rock, not as a frozen miracle, but as a record of human negotiation with limits. Petra is often remembered as a lost city. Perhaps it is better remembered as a city that kept changing form, a city of merchants, engineers, priests, families, rulers, guides, and later witnesses. A city that outlived the conditions that created it. A city that reminds us that history is not only made by conquest or collapse, but by the patient art of learning where water runs, where roads bend, and where human ambition can survive without ever fully defeating the land. The final mystery of Petra is not how it vanished. It is how much of it remained.